So my name is Peter Young. I am the class of '74 from Yale, and I'm going to be the moderator today for the 33rd in a series of Yale career panels that we've had since 2012. And the concept of this series has been very simply that, as smart as Yale students are and Yale alumni, the access to accurate information about different professions is actually quite limited. Recruiters don't tell you the truth, and for sure, making decisions based on what's on TV is dangerous. Someone told me that the number of people who are going into forensic science because of NCIS and bones and so forth is like a massively more than actual demand. But if anybody's actually gone through the New York Police Department's forensic department, believe me, they don't have these touch screens and all these fancy offices. So the whole idea of this is really to help Yale students and Yale alumni to make decisions based on more accurate information. So the panelists here have sworn that they're going to give a balanced point of view of both the good and the bad, so that you have better information. The other thing is that we do have a series of Yale career fireside chats on career issues, and we've had about 5 of those, and that ranges from how do you get on boards, how do you navigate major career decisions, and so forth, or how to interview. And we have that series which has been going on for the last 2 years, and that has been very helpful to people. Obviously, a little bit of a different emphasis. The last thing I want to say, though, is I do want, before we start, is the one thing that we can't do, and that you need to do for yourselves, is you need to do an accurate self-assessment. Because no matter how accurate the information is that you get about being a lawyer or investment banker or a consultant, if you don't have a good sense about yourself, what you're really good at, what you're really not good at, your preferences, do you like being outdoors or not, can you work on things that that take 5 years or not, then you're going to, even if you have wonderful information about a career, you still may make a mistake. So I encourage all of you to do some accurate self-assessment, get a friend who knows you, who's willing to be honest with you, and get a sense about yourself. Last thing I want to say is there's a small team of hardworking Yale alumni who put this together. We have Trish Takimoto here, we have Julie Song, and so these people have been helping for a long time, and they helped us produce a lot of these, and as well as a lot of cooperation from the Office of Career Strategies, the Yale Alumni Association, and so forth, who've helped promote this. The last thing I want to say is our next one is actually coming up fairly soon. It's November 6th at the same time, 4:30 East Coast time. It's Yale Career Panels, A Candid View of a Career in Politics, the Election Process. And actually, Trish Takimoto, who's here, will be the moderator. Actually, she wanted to title it Not Running for Office. So we're not going to have Andrew Yang or somebody here, talking about how to run for president. It's going to be all those careers that are around the whole election process, whether it's polling and so forth. And we thought it was quite timely, and Trish was smart in thinking about it because we're coming into an election year. So we thought that was a great idea. So with that, I'd like to get started. And very pleased to have 2 Yale graduates here, who are in consulting. Rob Henske, who is a partner at Roland Berger, who went to Yale undergraduate and Harvard Business School, and Vidar Segal, who is a vice president at EY Parthenon, and he's a Yale undergraduate, and he went to the University of Chicago MBA. And both of them have had more than one career. In other words, they didn't spend their whole life at these firms. You read the invitation, so you see that they have a varied backgrounds, and quite frankly, both of them also worked at smaller firms or economic consulting firms and so forth. So what they're going to bring to this discussion is not just what they're doing currently, but what they may have done in their careers. So what we'll do is we'll go through a set of questions, but then we'll leave time at the end for questions. from all of you here in person, but also online. And all I could say, though, is that you have two ways to ask a question if you're online. One is through the chat box, which is very easy to find, and the other is a Q&A function, where either one will get the question to us. Those of you who are here in person, well, you just have to raise your hand, right? Right, so you have it easy. So the reason why we thought this would be a good topic is because there's been a lot of interest in consulting, but then a lot of people have also been struggling with the question of, do I go with a large firm, a boutique firm, a specialist in a particular industry or not, a generalist strategy, so forth, because just to say consulting, that's pretty broad, right? Because there's so many different types of consulting firms doing all sorts of things. So I'd like to start out and just say, first of all, what is a good definition for the purpose of the people watching of a boutique consulting firm? I have my own view, but let's start by asking both of you your view.
Sure. I'm happy to go first. I think there are a couple of things that define a boutique consulting firm as opposed to a larger firm. One is obviously size, and the other thing is focus. I would say that boutique consulting firms tend to be smaller in terms of the number of employees they have. They may not have large networks of offices or large offices all over the world. And then the other thing is focus. Because they are smaller, they are more likely to have some sort of focus, whether that is focus on serving a particular type of client or focus on solving a specific problem for their clients, as opposed to larger firms, which because they usually have scale, they would probably be dealing with a whole host of clients, helping them solve a whole host of different issues.
So it's not size alone, although in general boutiques tend to be smaller than the large ones, but it's a lot the content, the focus, and so forth. Robert?
Thanks. If I go through, I like a written definition that I got, and I'll just read it and then I'll comment on it. A relatively small firm, and this is the relative because our firm's roughly $1 billion, so you can look at that and say it's fairly big, but relative to the big guys, it's quite small. Firm that provides a limited range of usually very specialized services, often at premium prices. And the key message here is, as a boutique firm, you have to specialize, because the world out there, since 2008, the world of consulting has bifurcated. And McKinsey, Bain, BCG, and the Big Four represent about 60% of the worldwide market right now. And that worldwide market's $147 billion, growing at 8% per year. So when you take that back, if you're competing against firms where they're $10 billion minimum size at this point, that tier, you have to be better than they are at what you do. So you have to be much more deliberate about how you go to market, what your USP is going to be able to win, because you're often competing with those firms. And if you try to compete on the same basis that they operate, you will lose.
Well, I disagree with you on that, but we'll move on. But I agree with your first part, which is your definition, which is, the two definitions of that. But whether who succeeds or doesn't succeed, why, I may disagree with you. By the way, just to give you some reference, I joined Bain & Company out of Harvard Business School, and there were 23 people. And no one thought of them as anything other than a boutique. And strategy consulting was considered to be a boutique niche practice.
Absolutely.
So depending upon where you are in history, it may have a different feel to it and so forth. Now, I think it's important, though, to also say there's some differences in the way that boutique firms operate that would relate to how a person would feel as an employee versus the larger firms. So maybe we can talk about that, because now it's a little complicated because they're all different types of boutiques, but to the extent you could be helpful and say there are some things that one could generalize about, right, with regard to the difference in experience, right? So if there was a Yale student, you're sitting and talking to them, they say, should I do boutique or not? But they don't say if it's healthcare or whatever. What would you say were the differences in terms of the actual experience that someone might have?
Rob, you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Interesting question. So I think in some ways the I mean, if you're working on an identical project in a big firm versus a small firm, in terms of like the day-to-day tasks and responsibilities, I think in some cases would be somewhat similar. I think some of the differences in terms of the experience of working in a boutique versus a large firm, I mean, there's definitely more emphasis on relationships, right? Because it's a smaller firm, you're more likely to know everyone, more likely to get exposure to senior people at the organization for mentoring and professional development relationships. I think it's easier to navigate, it's easier to find people and find projects that you're interested in working on, but at the same time, keep in mind you're in a smaller pond as opposed to a larger firm. So I think, so I think like, easier to navigate, more emphasis on relationships. And I think the last thing I would also say is that, and I know that people will laugh at me that this sounds like straight out of the marketing materials of a consulting firm, but I think that at a smaller firm, you need to be a little more entrepreneurial to start stuff that you're interested in, because at most large firms, someone's already thought of that idea or is already sort of driving that initiative, and often you're just kind of joining along. Where, like, for example, in my case, I'm very passionate about diversity and inclusion in our recruiting. So I've started a whole bunch of initiatives around LGBT recruiting within EY Parthenon. Now, at a large firm like a McKinsey, Bain, or BCG, that's something that they've been doing, for many, many years, and they already have very established processes around that. So I think that's another difference in the sense that at a small firm, there may be more opportunities to start stuff. Which can also be more challenging, whereas at a big firm, there are already a lot of established procedures and programs in place that you are often able to join.
Robert, differences from an
I agree with everything you just said. I'll elaborate on a few of the points. We don't have the resources to have these big fancy processes and do everything, so people have to step up and volunteer. And we have definitely, it's a very team-based culture. You're working with a smaller group of people. The social interactions of that are very important. We also have a much more senior engagement in the delivery. I think almost all boutiques I'm familiar with, the senior people are actually there day to day with the client, working with the team, which does impact sort of career development. It's a smaller group of people to look from, but you're probably going to see a more diverse group of people because they have come from different dimensions, they have different styles, and so you can learn from different people. So I think you can actually have a very fast learning curve from that perspective. The one challenge I see, and it's something that we grapple with all the time, is because of our specialization, our promotion path is actually longer than it is at many of the big firms, because you have to develop an expertise. And when you come in, and this goes to what level are you coming in at, if you're coming out of undergrad or out of business school, everybody needs a broad base of experience, work with many different people. So you typically get that. But by the time you get to be a project manager, you really have to have a degree of specialization for how do you add value to this smaller team for you to continue your career development. So you get forced into making choices perhaps earlier, and because of the need to develop that expertise, it may take longer to get up to the partner ranks.
Yeah. I want to say that one thing that it's funny because we always get criticized for not having a diverse enough panel. So if we have a panel with all women, we get criticized. If we have Asian Americans and it's whatever it is, we always get criticized. So we got a critical note about why there weren't any women on this panel. But one thing that's not diverse here, but I want to point out because no one's representing that part of consulting, is they are in firms where it's advice. So it's advice given by consultants, and they may do analysis, they may gather data, whatever. But I want you to remember that the consulting can be broader than that. So for example, there are consulting firms where it's a database. They have a proprietary database, and it's less people than it is a proprietary database. In that dynamic, it's very different from what they're saying. So, we couldn't have a panel of 500 people, so we're not. But you should just think more broadly and say, there are other different structures or value-added delivery mechanisms of different firms that are still under what you would call consulting. Anyway, you were saying?
Yeah, and I would just add on to what Rob said. This notion that you have to potentially specialize earlier in your career. I actually think that that's a good thing. And I mean, I can say this because I'm speaking to a bunch of Yale students and alum who, we love our liberal arts curriculum, and we love the ability to take courses in 10 different majors, 10 different academic areas, and that's great. But ultimately, when you sit in front of a client who is, let's say the client is a healthcare company, they want to know what healthcare expertise you have. Have you done projects on specifically helping other healthcare companies rein in their costs? Have you worked with any of my competitors? So specialization is, which is sort of a function, with something that has more importance in a boutique environment, is actually a good thing because it increases your credibility in front of a client, because you're someone who has focused on their type of client, their types of problems.
And it's not necessarily industry specialization. For example, there are consulting firms that just focus on human resources, right?
Yep.
Or cost reduction, or a variety of things. So, although it is common for specialization by industry, there are lots of different areas of specialization. Would you agree?
Within that, the only degree of non-specialization is if you're going to be successful, your team has to deliver value, and it needs to be viewed as having delivered value. If I take, whether it's performance improvement, it might have its own structure about how you measure it. If you're doing strategy, you could use shareholder value, but that's a very long dimension. And I come from a European firm, so it's much more balanced stakeholder analysis on this. But you have to be able to demonstrate that value in whatever domain space that you happen to be operating. And it isn't just industry, it's not just function. There are firms that organize by industry. We primarily organize by industry. There are firms that primarily organize by function. I acquired a company called Maricon Associates when I was at CRA, and they had one service offering. It was called economic profit. It was EVA applied broadly. That's all they did, that's all they wanted to do, and they were superb at it. But you get into other areas, and you would go to a different firm for those other kinds of services.
You were at an economic consulting firm, and had nothing to do with industry or IT or human resources. It was analysis of economics and growth and so forth. So, that actually points out to the fact that you should, if you're thinking about a boutique consulting firm, you should think about what you think you're really good at and really like. And if you really like technology, problems or whatever, then you should go, and you want consulting, you should go for a firm where they specialize in technology consulting, whether it's a large or a boutique firm, right? Would you agree?
Absolutely, and the most important factor as you think through that is every firm has a different culture. And you're going to spend a lot of time working with people. And it's going to be the same people, particularly if you're in a smaller firm or in a smaller office. And you can't be afraid to ask the question on how is it really to work here. That you have to fit in. And there's no such thing as there are some bad consulting firms, I agree. But in general, there are no such things as good firms, good business models, bad firms, bad business models. But there are different, and there are huge differences across the industry, and knowing what's important to you is going to be absolutely critical if you want to make this a career. If you want to make it a 2-year learning journey, which a lot of people come out of school and they want 2 years of great analytic training and problem-solving skills, and you're willing to survive anything for 2 years to get that training, it doesn't matter. But if you're thinking about this from a career perspective, the fit with the firm is probably the most important criteria.
Now we're going to switch out of just the boutique versus non-boutique and get to some other issues. But how is the profession headed? I mean, right now it's a boom period for consulting, so forth. But consulting isn't always at the peak and so forth. So what do the prospects look like? And by the way, there's a tendency of people going out of business school or or out of undergraduate to pick the hot industry, but you have a career that's longer, right? And sometimes they end up picking the hot industry just about the time it's going to take a dive. So what does it look like for consulting in general, as far as you know, in terms of what it looks like that we're headed maybe for a recession, blah, 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 right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of things that would cause people to say, well, maybe there might be a change, right?
Yeah. I think there are a couple of things that are sort of top of mind for my clients, especially at this point in time. So one is obviously digital, right? And I know that that's a big word that can mean a lot of things, but, and it again varies a lot from client to client, situation to situation. But it's basically how do you leverage digital and technology to engage with your customers, to improve your operations, to better, to become more profitable and more effective at what you do, right? So I think looking at how digital is touching every aspect of a company's business is definitely a top of mind concern for a lot of my clients. I think that Peter, you mentioned a recession. I mean, I think because I work a lot with private equity firms that are looking to buy companies and hold on to them for like 5 to 10 years and then go on to sell them. A big question on their mind is like, when is the next recession going to hit, and how is that going to impact my business? So I think that those are.
But you strayed from my question. Oh. My question is, how is consulting going to do? The question was not how are your clients going to do.
Well, so I would say that definitely more of a trend. The continued trend towards specialization is one area which we've already talked about. I think more on operations, on like actual implementation of strategies. I mean, I think people typically, a joke often made about strategy consultants in particular is that you produce an output which is a deck that just is presented before a board and then it goes into the trash. But now clients no longer want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just getting that deck. They want help, and they want assistance actually putting those strategies into action and being able to track that performance.
So I'm going to ask the question again, but more specifically. We are going to head towards an economic downturn. Consulting is not always a mandatory expenditure, right?
Yeah.
So now I'll rephrase the question, which is there a possibility that there is going to be a downturn in consulting revenues if in fact we're with the slowdown in the economy and because let's face it, look at every time you read the paper, companies are talking about cutting costs and so forth, right? And consulting is one of those costs, right? So.
Rob, do you want to take that?
So he doesn't want to answer the question. He turned it to you.
I've answered the question because I'm leading our current corporate strategy. We've been spending a lot of time around this. So if you look at the last decade of the consulting industry, even in 2008, 2009, the consulting industry grew. It grew at a slower pace. The growth rate slowed from approximately 8% to about 5%. So if you look at overall, the consulting industry grew during the great financial crisis. What you define as consulting in the sector you're in goes up and down dramatically with an economic cycle. So if I go through, in Europe right now, or let's pick an industry, automotive. You're consulting to the automotive industry. The automotive industry is going through massive sea change in terms of the whole industry structure. How people are thinking about owning cars. The volume of production is down. The technology is changing. Nobody's doing strategy right now. They're all in a survival mode because auto build is down.
Right.
And they're looking at consolidation. So the money is being spent on has changed significantly. The reason the consulting industry in 2009 didn't go down was because companies like Alex Partners in the US and Roland Berger in Germany restructured. And they went through in the US bankruptcy, and in Europe they went through they have a slightly different. But that part of the market exploded. So the industry itself, this massive industry, will continue to grow, and I believe as you go into economic downturn, and every one of my clients is focused on performance improvement, not growth strategies right now, and consolidation. As they go through that, what's one of the first things they cut? First thing they cut is strategy consulting. So strategy consulting is very economic cycle dependent. Performance improvement is sort of counter-cyclical to that. And corporate strategy departments and corporate planning departments, if the economy really goes down, they get eliminated, and then that increases the insourcing of consulting firms.
So actually, the point being, and actually, that's a very good answer because it does get to the right point, which is, again, if you're thinking about just a short-term career, like 2 years and I'll do something else, then a lot of this may not mean too much, right? It's more, what would I like to learn for 2 years? Because you don't care whether, 10 years from now, that sector is going to do well. If you're thinking about a longer-term career, though, then you've got to think about some of the things Robert's talking about, which is where are the trends? Where are the needs for clients going to be increasing? Where would they, where they decline? And so that's very important. So he gave some good examples, but there are a whole lot of different sectors and different ways of looking at it. So really strongly encourage that you ask yourself, one, would I think about it as a short-term career or long-term career? And then based on that, really study the different sectors of consulting and say where where is there going to be prosperity and where is there going to be, a disaster, right?
And the biggest balance as you think about that, when you're going from great economy towards bad, uncertainty, really good for the consulting business. You're going from really bad to glimmers of hope, it's really good for the consulting business. The really tough part and the role of what do you do in your service offer, if you're at the very bottom, you better be in performance improvement and restructuring. And if you're at the very top, you better be credible on growth strategy, or else you won't be participating in this industry for long.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
I would just second that. I think, and especially because we're talking about boutique consulting here, because boutique consulting firms tend to focus on a segment of the market. So if you're in a segment of the market that might potentially be more impacted, there are segments of the market that are likely to be more impacted. So for example, at our firm, we tend to do a lot of private equity transaction focused work. Like we help facilitate private equity transactions. And one of the things that we do think about is that, when a recession hits, we expect deal volume to decrease significantly. So as a result, we've been trying to position ourselves more towards also doing some more of the sort of performance improvement work that Rob just referenced. So I think, especially in the context of boutique consulting, you need to be a little mindful and thoughtful about, how is that specific segment of the market going to be impacted? Because at a large firm, some segments in a recession, some would go up, some would go down. So net, there's more sort of diversification. But I think with boutique consulting firms, there's a little more vulnerability because of that focus.
You said something very interesting, which is, Yale is our, liberal arts. They're good at a lot of things. By the way, for that reason, I want to make a point. Well, first of all, I personally am not sure that selecting people who have 4.0s and so forth is good, because that doesn't mean necessarily that they're the best addition to the student body. Einstein would not have gotten into Yale because his writing skills were not very good, right? And yet, to say that he would contribute less than someone who got a 4.0 is good and everything. The other, though, the dark side of it is that it makes it harder for you to decide. Because if you're only good at one or two things, it's a lot easier to decide what to do than if you happen to be legitimately good at like 4 or 5 things. So that's one of the dangers here, right? Because consulting feels a lot like, oh, gee, I'll learn a lot of different things in exposure. And the one thing I would encourage you not to do is to say, oh, I can't decide yet what I do, so if I work for a consulting firm, it'll give me exposure to lots of different things to help me make my career decision, right? And I think a lot of people make that mistake, and it's not necessarily true. I think we talk to people in consulting, it's not like they say, okay, we're going to rotate you through 10 different industries over the next year so you can get a sense of automotive and this. That's not how it works, right? So don't use consulting as a way of just postponing making a career decision and thinking it's going to give you information to do that. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree to it. I mean, I would say that consulting definitely gives you a little more variety as opposed to, say going and working for an automotive company or going and working for a consumer goods company. But I do agree that, you shouldn't choose consulting because you don't know what to do.
Right.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't go to law school because you don't know what to do. Because 3 years and a lot of money is like a very expensive way of postponing things,
Yeah.
Right? And a lot of people do that, right? Which is sad, right? Particularly with parents who have to pay the tuition, right? So what advice would you give, though? You've seen so many people, both of you are, have been in consulting for a while. And I think you've probably seen a lot of people come, junior people join and so forth. What advice would you give people about traits that clearly make someone incompatible with consulting, even though they don't know it, but also traits that are really good predictors of someone being good and happy, right? By the way, I make that distinction because you could be good and unhappy. I guess you can, it's kind of hard to be happy and not good, but but just because,
Trust me, I've seen it.
no, but so you see the point. So I'm going to ask both of you that because you've seen lots of people, you've hired people, you've seen people go in, so forth. It'll help all the people here in the audience sort of self-select a little bit, right?
So let's start with some of the requirements of the job, and I'll beat Peter to the punch. They're different segments, they're different business models, but for the most part, you travel. And if you don't want a job that has you traveling Monday through Thursday, chances are you need to work for one of the big fours in one of their office-based systems, because everybody else requires you to travel, and our clients are all over the place. I happen to live in Boston. I only have one client in Boston. I've done 21 trips to Europe this year, so you do travel a lot. The second issue is you can't be afraid of analytics. To get people over the hump to make really challenging decisions, which they couldn't get their organization to make without bringing outsiders in, it has to be fact-based. So you have to have analytics, so you can't be afraid of, we are going to run Excel spreadsheets or more statistical models, and there is a skill set which most firms will help you develop when you do that. The other thing is you are influencing people, and it is much easier if you like people. And it's a team-based sport, so you're going to spend time, and so there are people that would much rather sit in their cubicle and do their work. And there are parts of the consulting firm which are really good for that. But the part that really turns me on is getting clients to really make hard decisions and to carry them forward, and that's influencing people. So you have to be willing to be outgoing, even if your Myers-Briggs tells you you're an introvert. You still have to be able to influence people.
So Dr. House would not have done well.
Yes.
Man, I tell you, I respect him, but I guess he wouldn't have done well. Your comment on that?
I would agree with everything Rob just said. I think just two more things. So one is just you have to be driven and you have to be willing to work hard, right? In terms of drive, what I mean there is like you are working on like really, really challenging problems that you take ownership of. And like, you have to really be driven to, doing everything that it takes to give your client a convincing answer and, to turn every stone within obviously bounds of reason. And to take that initiative to do that yourself, to be that strong team player that Rob mentioned. And then I said, hardworking. I mean, most consultants do not work 9-to-5 jobs. On average, you will be spending more hours in the office in consulting than you would say in some other industries. There are obviously, commensurate rewards with that, but just keep that in mind that if you're looking for a, strict and stable 9-to-5 job, then consulting is probably not the best fit for you.
If I could add 2 points on that. So we've done a lot of work around this. If I take expectations of people going into consulting, they expect their work week to be 60 hours. In reality, it's typically more than 60 hours if I look across firms. And everybody's trying to deal with this, but these are pretty long days, and it's a client-facing industry. So if the client has absolutely unrealistic expectations, we'll burn the candle at both ends to meet those expectations. That's how we stay in business. So you just need to understand that. I forgot my second point.
Well, but to elaborate on that, so that's actually a very important point, because you have to look at yourself and say, what kind of lifestyle do I want, right? And what's important to me? And if you really need to have a certain amount of free time, consulting may not be the right one. If not, maybe it's okay, but those are the kinds of things that are not even content, right? It's just a lifestyle that you have to figure out and be honest with yourself about, right?
One more personality dimension. You kind of have to have thick skin. It's, despite how friendly we all are in all of this.
Well, not all of us are. You may be.
We are typically, and I had this with Brown tennis when my daughter was applying, and they said everybody was in the top 20 or the top 100 in the country, and I looked around and Brown was number 6 in the Ivy League, and each team had 10 people. I said, I don't think so. We all hire the top of the classes. It is competitive to get in. We typically, on undergrad, are interviewing 10 people per every slot. For business school, it's probably more like 20 people for every slot we have. So it is competitive. And we're hiring people that have been successful in everything that they do. And then we have a bell curve. Do you meet expectations? Do you exceed expectations, or do you partially meet expectations? And we have about 10% that exceed expectations and about 10% that partially meet expectations, which means somebody who's never gotten anything but an A their entire life all of a sudden finds out that they're graded as a C. And for us, that means you're doing a great job, but it's really hard for people to hear that they are not super special, particularly people coming out of perhaps the Ivy League institution in Boston. I won't blame Yale's on this one. But you will get very direct feedback. Because our challenge is getting enough people and getting them to be able to be successful consultants as quickly as possible. And as a result, you get true constructive feedback, and you have to be willing to do that. And candidly, not everybody wants constructive feedback. They want to hear that they are always the best. And that's just part of, I think, the culture of all firms. And some are better equipped at delivering the message in a friendly fashion versus others. But a lot of the firms have up or out policies, and it's a forced curve, and people are exited. Even though you might be an absolutely brilliant, hardworking person. So you just need to make sure that you take the feedback and say, how do I learn from this? And recognize when you join a consulting firm, the first thing you have to assure yourself of and your case team of is 0 defects.
But the other thing is that there are really different styles and cultures. And so, analytical side, and what he said is they're very different personalities, how they manage teams, so forth. So I think there's the general consulting, shall we say, picture, but you have to look at individual firms. It's just like investment banking. I'm an investment banker. Well, I got to tell you, I ran an industry group at Sombros, and it is very different from running an industry group at Lehman Brothers, right? Totally different, same thing. I was running the chemical industry group, exactly the same job, but it was totally different because although the joke used to be, the good news about Sombros is if someone wants to stab you, they stab you from the front, whereas at Morgan Stanley, they stab you from the back. That was one of the pluses that they said was about being at Sombros. But same investment banking, but very, very different personalities. So you should also look at and that's not industry specific, right? So whether it's consulting, investment banking, or whatever, you have differences in personality. So first, you also ought to learn that, right? Because I'm almost certain that personalities of these two firms are different, right? Not better or worse, but different, right? So,
On that front, for people that are actually thinking about moving into consulting, I couldn't tell you how to find it on our website, but our entire campus pitch is, there's no such thing as good or bad consulting. Make sure you get the right fit. And it lays out differences of different types of consulting. And it has example questions that you should be asking in the interview process to make sure you're getting the answers, because it's very standard. You ask an answer, you get a bland reply, or you ask a question, you get a bland reply, and you haven't learned anything in the process. And that was what we were experiencing. And we did it because we made some hiring mistakes. People that came in and said, I didn't understand this is how this firm works. So we actually switched it around. So there is a presentation someplace on our website, probably under careers, but I'd encourage you to read that. It's not a Roland Berger specific presentation. It's really, you're looking at consulting, how should you be thinking about the kind of firm you want to work for?
now, the next question is, and this is actually a question, by the way, except for the first question I said, what's a boutique versus non-boutique, all these other questions, we have stayed with the same questions since the first one we did for legal in April of 2012, right? So the same ones. Now, in this case, this last question is one that's particularly important to ask in consulting, which is, if you don't stay into the profession until retirement, what are the exit routes to other professions? It's particularly true in consulting because it's not a profession where the typical thing is you go all the way up to being partner, right? There's a lot of up and out and turnover, whereas, I don't know, if you work for Nestle, right, you might, the typical might be that you stay all the way through. So I guess the question is this, one is probably more common than not, that you don't stay for that long. But comment on that. What do people end up doing when they leave, consulting, right? And I realize it may vary according to what kind of consulting, but any comments about that?
Well, yeah, without, like sugarcoating it, but I do think that consulting is definitely one of the most versatile professions in terms of exit opportunities, right? And I'm not sort of tooting our own horn here, but if you look at from our firm, people go on to work obviously in corporate roles and corporate strategy roles, or say if you're an operational consultant, you could go and work in an operational role. People go on to work in different sort of managerial roles, such as a product manager role, for example, because you have that experience of taking ownership of a team and an engagement. People go on to work in private equity, in some cases work in finance, because you have that quantitative and analytical skill set. So, I think that relative to other professions, consulting definitely gives you a wider array of exit opportunities. The exact nature of those opportunities would obviously depend on the type of consulting that you've done, right? So as I said, if you're an operations consultant, your exit opportunities, you're probably more likely to get a corporate operations job as opposed to a job working in an investment bank, right? So, but I would say in general, consultants go on to do more, a more diverse array of things than say like a doctor or a lawyer.
Oh yeah, no, they're more viable exit routes, I guess, right? Robert?
It's a great training ground on problem solving, so any job that has a problem solving issue essentially becomes open. Good example, so we regularly put people into corporate strategic planning departments. That seems to be a primary exit path for our staff that leave. So my team is Boston-based. We lost one of our young consultants to CVS as CVS was looking at expanding into the insurance issue. They were building up an internal team. And if you have a consulting pedigree, you're very attractive to those. If you happen to be a project manager, that's probably the most valuable time to switch as a consulting firm. Every consulting firm needs project managers, and every industrial firm needs project managers. And you can pretty much write your ticket at that level. So you're typically 5 or 6 years into consulting, you've demonstrated the ability to run teams. You can go into planning, you can go into business unit jobs. You can go into private equity or support different private equity. You can decide you want to take that into a different part of the consulting business, and you can certainly take it into many different industry jobs.
I'll try to put a balance to what you're saying, and that is one thing that is really different. And by the way, so when I came out of business school, I was going to join Goldman Sachs. Bill Bain called me, said, "You've never heard of me." I said, "That's true." "You have no interest in consulting." "That's true." He said, "We have lunch with these." I said, "Well, why?" So he had lunch with me, but he's an incredibly persuasive guy.
Yes.
And he said, and it was the 2 years. He says, "We know you're going to be investment banking. If you work for 2 years, you'll be an better investment banker." That was actually a good argument. And in fact, it did help me long term. I just stayed for 7 years instead of 2, and we went from 23 people to 800 people. So that, but then went into private equity and then investment banking. But I think one thing I've noticed, so I know the different personalities and so forth, is that consulting may teach you teamwork and problem solving, but you're not really working in a organizational environment, right? So I found that people who come out of consulting or investment banking and so forth, they have very poor skills or experience in operating within a larger corporate environment. And that's where there's a lot of, I mean, classic, the failure rate of investment bankers, for example, which is a lot like consulting, right? Going into the corporate world is very high. Why? Because they don't know how to deal with, you know, the legal department or whatever, so because their relationship with those is very different if they're the client than if it's, so one thing to think about is that, which is, to the extent you want to be able to really run things, consulting doesn't help you do that. Investment banking doesn't. I wouldn't hire an investment banker to run a lemonade stand because that's not what the skill base that they've been trained at, right? Right? So ask yourself that. So one, you should ask yourself what skill base you have, right? But also what you like to do. If you like to run businesses, then probably consulting or investment banking or private equity doesn't make sense, right? Because that's not what you're paid, you know, paid to do. So now we have a bunch of questions up there. The bad news, we're in a new conference room, and so the screen is so far away that I'm going to have to ask Trish Takemo to help us read some of these questions. And there are a lot of them, so that's good.
Okay, so the first one is, you mentioned undergraduate and MBA applicants. What are the different considerations a PhD applicant should have when researching and applying to boutique firms?
Well, good question. Either one of you?
Go for it.
Different firms have different views on hiring PhDs. Typically a PhD, and I don't want to insult anybody, but you become very deep and more narrow. So you have a degree of expertise that you have devoted many years of your life, so you have to find somebody who values that. So we will occasionally hire PhDs. We have actually had a difficult time getting the PhDs to be able to step back out of the technical details to the broader business issue. And primarily we're looking at STEM type degrees when we're thinking about hiring people. So other firms might have a very different perspective of different kinds of PhDs.
By the way, I want to make one comment, which is just yesterday we decided, right, Trish, to have a Yale career fireside chat on how do you exit the academic track. And apparently that was advice we got actually from Yale saying it would be great if you did this because there's so many people who go through a PhD program and then decide they don't want to go to academia, or go into academia and at some point decide they don't want to continue, and then they don't know what to do. So there will be one in the spring, but this is actually a classic. We get some smiling faces, so we here in the room, so I guess there's some people who identify with that. Right?
I would agree. I think that a PhD is, you know, you have as Rob mentioned, you have a very specific skill set, and I think it's somewhat of a challenge is to find the firm and find the opportunity that really kind of values that specialized skill. But at the same time, I mean, keep in mind that as a PhD, you've been like narrowly focused on this one topic and one subject area for many, many years. When you come into a consulting context, while you will still be sort of the subject matter expert on whatever statistics, for example, you will still be expected to work on problems that go beyond that narrow that area of focus that you've traditionally had.
But there's also what Robert was saying, which is attention span, right? So a typical person getting a PhD thinks in terms of multiple years to get a project done, right, or book or whatever. Consulting is not short attention span, but a typical project may not go more than
3 months.
3 months.
Yeah.
Now then, if you were an investment banking trader, you have an attention span of about 3 seconds. I had a friend of mine who was, when I was at Lehman, who was in the M&A department, and then he moved to the trading department. And we joked about 2 months later, he says, my attention span appears to have gone down, and in fact, it's less than my 2-month-old son. So that's the other issue, right, which is a different way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
Next question?
Actually, the question was about transitioning from PhD STEM into consulting.
Oh, boy. Well, I think we've answered that. So let's go to the next one.
If I have one offer from a smaller company with less name recognition, but a culture and location I prefer, and another offer from a very large firm with much more name recognition in a location and a culture that I do not prefer, bearing in mind that I have no idea in the slightest what I want after consulting, what questions would you want to answer if you were in my position?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Who wants to touch that third rail?
I'm going to start with a simple answer. Life is short to be in a miserable environment for a long period of time.
I completely agree.
If you know you're going to do a 2-year stint and you want McKinsey on your CV, go work for them. Recognizing you're going to, I'm jumping to conclusions because I've made this choice at least 3 times in my life that I didn't see how I fit into their culture. But you have to go to a place that is an environment that you want to be in, because as I said, we say you're going to work 60 hours, you're going to work 80 hours. It's going to be your social life for quite a bit of time, and life is just too short to be in an environment you don't want to be in. That's my simple answer.
I would completely agree. I think, but putting it into context, as exactly as Rob mentioned, if this is something you want to do for 2 years and get out of it, then you're probably optimizing for the best reputation and the best brand and the best sort of exit opportunities. Then I potentially an argument could be made for picking the more prestigious position. But recognize that if this is something you want to do long term, it is very difficult to be good at something that you're miserable doing. So if you want to do that long term, then pick the one where you'll actually be happy.
But I think part of this answer is a personal answer, right? A personal issue. Different people have a different view about how important the name is, right?
Yeah.
Right? And you have to ask yourself how important that is. For some people, they don't care. For other people, it is really, really important to them. So I think you just have to think about yourself and say, of all the different things that are important to you in a job, whatever, how important is it that you can go to a cocktail party and everybody's heard the name of your firm?
Yeah.
I made the choice, I turned, I hit these offers from investment banks, Stanley, Goldman Sachs, so forth, and I joined Bain & Company who no one ever heard of. I mean, literally no one heard of, right? Because there were 23 people, that was it. And it was the ultimate boutique that no one ever heard of, right? But it was a very good decision for me in the end, right? And that turns out Bain ended up doing well and successful, but the content to me was very important, right? And so I was very, very pleased that I did that. But it's a very personal decision. Next question?
Oh, well, there's also, you wanted to know about the website, about the interview, so that's the Rolenberger.
I think it's rolenberger.com.
Very good answer. Well done. Next question. Oh,
Can I
the
have
question
a
here. Go
Okay,
ahead.
so you were talking a lot about about culture specifically, and you also mentioned that there's such limitation in terms of understanding the culture of a company from their website only. Would you?
You can't do it from a website only.
Exactly.
You
So
know,
would you three mind to explain more about the culture of your company and what you really love about it and
So if I were starting the search over, and
Uh-huh.
you have to be careful. When I joined Roland Berger in the US, we had a German culture, and my entire job has been to change the culture. And I think I've done a good job. But Vault is a great place. You can research on Vault. You can go to Glassdoor. And typically you get more negative comments, so reality is probably better than what you read on those. There's a website called Fishbowl. And if you can get into the consulting portal on that, you can ask any question and people give very honest answers. Something that I track on a continuous basis just because it helps me understand what are people thinking about across different firms. And it's as ridiculous as, you know, can I expense dry cleaning of socks, you know, at the one extreme to I have a boss that I think is doing something that they shouldn't be, how do I do? There's a broad range of this. Your former employer from a bit of a time ago did a really nice job. They set up literally a call-in for a live interchange with the CEO of Bain. Where it gave people the opportunity to literally type in, I'd like to know about how did you progress your career, what do you really look for when you talk to the people, how do people get excited. So those are three really good sources of information. The other thing is, you have friends that work for every one of these firms.
Yeah.
And everybody would be happy to talk to you about their firm, because almost everybody is proud
Or
of their firm.
talk about the other firms.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, in fact, it's even more valuable to talk to someone who works for a competitor who is a friend, right? Who's not going to give you a bunch of bullshit or so forth, right? Because anyone who works in an industry also has pretty good information about, particularly about culture and so forth, right? About the other competitors. So reach out. He's got a good point. Reach out to people, and it's amazing how generous Yale alumni are, even if they're total strangers. You can go and find someone and contact them, and it's amazing how generous people are. So take advantage of that. You know, people you know, and also Yale graduates who may be in the industry.
Yeah, I get several Yale requests just to talk about consulting per month. And I do my best to try to reply to those. I assume everybody gets similar kinds of numbers, and that it is a fairly friendly community in terms of reaching out.
Next question? Anyone in this room, first of all?
I have
Yeah, go
a
ahead.
question, similar to the the transitioning from a PhD program. Is there anything in particular that, I'm an attorney and I'm considering transitioning, is there anything in particular that, you know, an attorney, a practicing attorney should keep in mind about what the experience might be like, or how we're looked at, you know, from a hiring perspective?
I have a friend who was an attorney and got recruited to go work for McKinsey. So let me talk about McKinsey's program. They assume attorneys know nothing about business. And they started with a 3-month training program where they basically gave a McKinsey MBA, and it was a program for attorneys because they hire a fair number of attorneys into the system. And it was a fabulous job training program. After that, you're treated just like everybody else, but they basically say, we want to make sure you not only know how to deal with the legal aspects on the job, but that you know what it is we do and how we do it. They really had a great program. Candidly, we haven't hired, in the US, we haven't hired any attorneys, so I don't know how we would actually think about it. It'd really come across, we all do a case interview, and it's sort of testing logic patterns. I think most attorneys have pretty good logic structures, and so that would be how we would evaluate somebody coming in.
I would agree. I mean, I think that different firms, depending on whether or not they actively recruit lawyers, may have programs to help you make that transition. I think the other thing to keep in mind, especially as you're interviewing and applying, is to really make the case about why you would be a good fit, because you're obviously, I mean, I'm very used to interviewing MBAs, right? So I know exactly what skills they have. I mean, it just makes sense to me that an MBA would apply to consulting. right? And it obviously makes sense to you as a lawyer to apply to consulting, so you have to convince me that, why is it that you want to do consulting, and what specific skills have you gained in your legal work that are transferable to consulting. And I think you have to kind of walk the interviewer and the recruiter to make that connection for them, because, as opposed to an MBA, because, people, we know what skills they come with, we know what experience they have, so it's kind of a more natural fit, whereas I think you have to make the connection and make that case a little more practical.
And this actually links, as you go into that process, have a great reason why you think you want to make the career change. Because that's question number one, why are you here talking to us? And do it in the context of really knowing what the firm you're talking about actually does, because as we've spoken, consulting is in the eye of the beholder. And just about anything can be described as consulting. And how you describe what you're looking for, if it has no resonance with what the firm you're talking to actually does, you'll get disqualified immediately, versus, wow, you've done your homework, you've thought about this, you're adding value to the discussion.
So try to really be thoughtful. I think that know yourself objectively, do your homework on the industry, in different segments of the industry, and really do your homework on the company. And if you do those three things, the chance that you, one, will make the right career decision, but two, that you will end up with a good opportunity at those companies will be significantly higher. Now, we have run out of time. First of all, I want to thank the two panelists here who have, I think, you've met the criteria for a good panelist, which is a very thoughtful but also candid description of the answers. Otherwise, we've occasionally had panelists that have gone rogue, and we've had to, pull them in and tell them, no, radiology is not the only good profession in the world. By the way, that's a true story. But the other is that, to the extent I'm sure that you want maybe to follow up with and so forth, please you do so. Maybe the best thing is there's a Yale career panels at gmail.com. If you want to be able to connect with one of them, just send a note and then I'll let them decide what to do. This is being recorded, so it'll be on the yalecareerpanel.com website, where we also have something like 35 recordings of the last 38 or 39 events, so that if you want to go back and see what did somebody say about consulting, 5 years ago, you can watch it, or, explore drama and film or whatever it may be, right? The last thing I just want to remind you that on November 6th, we have the Trish Takimoto's going to be moderator on a candid view of a career in politics, the election process, but not as a candidate. In January, Jan 28th, Justin Coslin, who is part of the team that does these, is going to do a very interesting one on product management, because a lot of jobs are product manager is really a multidisciplinary job, right? And many Yale students go into product management, but it might be at Microsoft, but it might be at General Motors, right? So, and you've mentioned product management about 3 times, right? So that's going to be interesting. We're going to have one on, how do you exit from the academic track. So there'll be a number this coming couple of months that I think will be interesting. So I want to thank all of you. I'm sorry we didn't answer every question, but I hope all of you found this very useful. And I want to again thank the two panelists.